Nuke Talk, formerly Press the Button, is a podcast brought to you by Plowshares, the largest foundation solely focused on reducing the threat of nuclear weapons.
So, a little bit about nuclear weapons history.
Just a little?
Okay, maybe more than a little. We're talking about almost a century of history, after all. Nuclear weapons go back all the way to 1942 with the Manhattan Project, the unprecedented government program in which the United States rushed to develop and deploy the world's first atomic weapons before Germany during World War II.
And we've never really been able to fully escape nuclear weapons tensions since then.
Right, we've opened Pandora's box. Thankfully, tensions haven't risen as high as they were during the Cold War, but we've seen nuclear threats involved in Russia's invasion of Ukraine and other conflicts.
And don't also forget the over 12,000 nuclear weapons that are still out there. This isn't something that happened overnight.
Choices were made that got us here. The United States and other nuclear-capable countries made choices to build their nuclear stockpile and test dozens of nuclear weapons with the full knowledge that surrounding communities and land would be harmed. Good news is, we can also make choices to get out of this mess.
It really makes a person wonder how the US was able to do all of that.
Wartime secrecy was a big part of that. Los Alamos, the city where they built the first atomic bomb, was a complete secret even to many of the workers who helped build it. If you listen to Season 2, The Shadow of Oppenheimer, you know that we talked about Los Alamos, New Mexico, a lot. So, quick refresher, and I do really mean quick, because Christopher Nolan took 3 hours to tell this story. New Mexico was selected as the location, apparently due to J. Robert Oppenheimer's affinity for it due to the time he spent there as a child. But because of that affinity, it was the location of the Trinity test, the first nuclear weapons explosion which took place on July 16, 1945. The plutonium device was detonated 100 feet in the air, releasing 20 to 22 kilotons of TNT, casting followed across an area nearly 250 miles long and 200 miles wide.
That was a really great summary.
Thank you.
But one thing that Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer didn't quite cover was that today, New Mexicans continue to experience negative health effects related to the Trinity test. Citizens in New Mexico only recently became eligible for the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, known as RECA, and generations of New Mexicans have been affected by the consequences of the Trinity test. Unfortunately, New Mexico is not the only city in the US that was part of the Manhattan Project or the United States' continued development of nuclear weapons.
A big part of nuclear policy is thinking about the future of nuclear weapons and imagining alternative pathways towards a better future. But thinking about the future means also thinking about the past and learning from the choices and mistakes that were made. It also allows us to understand the circumstances of the present that inform the choices currently being made and differing attitudes towards those choices.
Like, for example, in the top 5 largest employers in New Mexico, you'll find the U.S. federal government, Sandia Laboratory, and Los Alamos Laboratory.
Exactly. Los Alamos is the most famous place associated with the atomic bomb, but there are actually many other locations across the United States that were created for nuclear weapons production or have exceptional relationships with nuclear weapons. Those locations include cities that were part of the Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, as well as cities such as Rocky Flats, Colorado, and Amarillo, Texas.
The creation and production of the atomic bomb left its mark not only on U.S. foreign policy, but on the cities where production was centered and the lives and relationships of the people who lived in those cities. We're talking about nuclear weapons' influence on race, socioeconomic status, and the environment, and how all of that has carried on to modern day.
So sit back, kick up your feet, and tune into what we're calling Season 3 of the podcast, Atomic Assembly. I'm Angela Kellett, the executive producer, here with my co-host Jacqueline Shing, who is the marketing and communications specialist at Plowshares.
That's me. Thanks for the intro, Angela.
Of course. So let's get started. After all, when it comes to nuclear weapons history, there's a lot to cover, especially for the first city on our list that was created by and for the Manhattan Project, Hanford, Washington. Over 80 years ago, Hanford was miles and miles of open farmland. Now it's known as the most contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere. So how did it end up like this? The Hanford site, home to the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor, began operations in September 1944. During its first half-a-decade-long operation, Hanford produced around 70 tons of plutonium, approximately two-thirds of the plutonium in the U.S. nuclear stockpile at the time. Plutonium from Hanford was also used for the Trinity test and the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. You'll notice that Hiroshima isn't mentioned. That's because two different bomb designs were used to achieve nuclear fission in 1945. So quick definition of fission here. Fission occurs when a neutron strikes and splits a larger atom, breaking it into smaller nuclei. When an atom splits, it releases an enormous amount of energy. Nuclear weapons use that energy to create the devastating explosion that they're known for. Still with me? Great. Little Boy, the bomb used on Hiroshima, was a gun-type weapon that achieved nuclear fission by shooting one piece of uranium-235 at another piece. Back in the early days of fission research, the isotope uranium-235 was an attractive choice for scientists thinking about nuclear weapon designs because of its ability to easily undergo fission. But the thing about uranium-235 is that in the late 1930s, scientists believed that separating enough uranium-235 from uranium ore would take about 3 to 5 years in the most optimistic of circumstances. To politicians and scientists, this was a worrisome amount of time while a war was ongoing. But in early 1941, the discovery of plutonium-239, another isotope similar to uranium-235, in that it readily undergoes fission, provided scientists with the second possible route to the bomb that they could explore. That route ultimately led to Fat Man, a plutonium-fueled nuclear weapon being dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. But first, that route led to Hanford, Washington, the first full-scale plutonium production reactor in the world. To learn more about the construction around the Hanford facility, we spoke with Steve Olson. Steve is a science writer and author of the book Apocalypse Factory, Plutonium Making in the Atomic Age. He grew up in Washington State in eastern Washington, in a very small town named Othello, Washington, which is about 15 miles away from Hanford.
A lot of my inspiration was growing up so close to the Hanford plant. We, of course, knew it was over there. And for those of us who were interested in science, and I was very interested in science, this was the early 1960s, so not too long after Sputnik, and science education was being emphasized in the United States, and I certainly got swept up in that. For those of us who knew science, we knew what was happening at Hanford, that it was the facility that was making plutonium for the atomic bombs in the U.S. arsenal. But in the 1960s, it was the height of the Cold War. We had very different attitudes toward the U.S. government and toward the government's activities. If the government was doing it in the early 1960s, people didn't have a tendency to question those activities as much as they do today. That's for sure. And at that time, Hanford was very secret. People who worked there, like my grandfather, who was a pipe fitter at Hanford at various times in the 1950s and 1960s, were not allowed to tell anyone what it was that they did, and not even their families. So a lot of families did not know what their fathers or mothers were doing out at Hanford, which was called the site in the towns that were nearby. It was best not to ask questions, and that was pretty much what people did back then when Hanford was booming and was producing plutonium at such a rapid rate.
Across the country, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which could be considered Hanford's sister city in many ways, was being built to explore different methods of enriching uranium for the bomb. But that's a different story for a different day. Today we're talking about plutonium. Hanford, Washington was chosen because the location fulfilled a number of requirements. Originally, the plutonium production plant was slated to be located in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, but Manhattan Project scientists raised concerns about the extremely hazardous production process, potentially contaminating the nearby region. It was decided that a more remote location was needed. As government officials began the search for such location, they drafted additional requirements for the site, which included an area of at least 12 by 16 miles, easy access to a large body of water that could be used to cool the reactors, a relatively flat landscape, and a location well situated by railroad and other forms of transportation. The Hanford site was chosen in late December of 1942. The site's flat landscape, arid weather, and the abundant water supply from the nearby Columbia River suited the selection criteria. Like Los Alamos, New Mexico, the isolated location of Hanford, Washington, meant that the facility could not rely on the usual practice of hiring and housing its workforce in a nearby large city. They would have to construct an entirely new town to serve the site's needs and workforce.
The nearest towns were three small farming communities on the Columbia River. They were the towns of Richland and Kennewick and Pasco. Today we call those the Tri-Cities here in Washington State, but that was not a term that was really used with any frequency until the 1950s or 1960s. There were two other small farming communities within the site of Hanford. One was the town of Hanford, and one was the town of White Bluffs. When the United States chose Hanford as the site for these plutonium production facilities, everyone in those towns, they had about 200, 250 people each in Hanford and Richland and White Bluffs, got a letter saying they had somewhere between 3 weeks and 3 months to move out of those towns, to forfeit their land to the federal government, and they would be paid for that land at some point in the future after the government sent assessors to figure out how much the land was worth. That led to many court cases that extended throughout World War II and into the years thereafter, since the government, in often cases, did not give people the amount of money for their land that they thought that they deserved. But in any event, it was World War II. People realized that the government had asked them to move out of their farms. They really had no choice. And so they abandoned their farms and homes, moved to other towns, Hanford and White Bluffs, and to some extent, Richland became ghost towns. And then the government started constructing these facilities. Tens of thousands of workers were moved to the site and lived in gigantic construction camps. The construction camp in Hanford was the fourth largest city in Washington State in 1944. 50,000 people lived there, so far more people than were ever there before, which is an indication of both the resources that the federal government was devoting to this whole plan and the fact that it was so urgent. They really felt that they were in a race with Germany to develop atomic bombs, and that the United States had to develop bombs first, or Germany would win World War II and would exert its domination over as much territory as it felt that it could achieve. So they built up this gigantic facility very quickly. The first reactor to go online at the Hanford plant, what's called the B reactor, from the breaking of ground for the foundation to when Enrico Fermi came to Hanford and started it up, took only 11 months. It's just an incredible amount of time. I mean, when people talk about the Manhattan Project, they talk about the government undertaking huge projects, yes, but also doing so very quickly, because that was another aspect of what happened at Hanford, is how quickly they were able to build 3 very large reactors and 3 other plants, chemical plants essentially, to separate plutonium out of the irradiated fuel cells, the fuel rods that were coming out of these reactors. So yes, it was a massive effort that would not have been possible without some of the personalities, especially General Leslie Groves, the leader of the project, to be able to get all this done.
In securing Hanford for the Manhattan Project, the government also forced the removal of Native American tribes. Hanford sat on the lands of the Wanapum tribe, Nez Perce, Yakima Nation, and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. These tribes were forced 40 miles northwest and were not offered relocation settlements. Even the dead had to leave Hanford. The Army dug up 177 graves from the cemetery in White Bluffs and relocated the remains to the town of Prosser. There are 3 towns that are directly associated with the Hanford plant, which are known as the Tri-Cities. These towns are Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, and they developed in very different ways.
It was really interesting because, as I mentioned, there were 3 towns in the Tri-Cities once the towns of Hanford and White Bluff were emptied to make room for the reactors. Before that, They had just been small farming and railroad towns. The Northern Pacific came through that area. And so Pasco in particular had grown up around the railroad, as had Othello, the town that I grew up. But once Hanford was established, it was decided that Richland, out of which all the farmers and orchardists were moved, would be the place where all of the engineers and operators for the Hanford facility lived. So the government came in and actually sort of manufactured a town. In my book, I describe it as, in some ways, the first suburb, in that tract housing was erected in a very planned community with planned central shopping areas, housing around it so that people could walk into the center of town and get everything they need. I mean, it was really an amazing place. People who grew up in Richland in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s really describe it as a wonderful place to grow up because of the planning that went into the town and how easy it was to live there. But that was a town that was created for the people who worked at Hanford, and you essentially had to work at Hanford to be able to live in that town. Even the construction workers didn't live in Richland. The construction workers tended to live in these large construction camps that were built out in the middle of the desert, or they would live in Kennewick, a little bit down the Columbia River from Richland, or in Pasco, the town that was farthest away from Richland. And because of that history, the towns have really evolved in a different way as well. They still have very different characters today. Now the Tri-Cities is quite a large area. My goodness, I think it has 300,000 people who live there altogether. It's become sort of a retirement area in the desert, like other places in the desert western United States. But the original imprints of those towns can still be felt when you go and visit them, especially Richland, which remains a town very much oriented towards science and technology, even today, just like it was back in the 1940s and in the 1960s when I was growing up in Othello.
As these towns developed, there was a racial divide that was established quite early. Richland was chosen as the site for a more permanent town for Hanford's engineers and plant operators. A lot more thought and care was put into the construction of Richland. Residents enjoyed a much more middle-class lifestyle than in Hanford's construction camps. Richland contained movie theaters, beauty shops, and restaurants. Minorities and other workers who did not rank highly enough were housed further down the Columbia River in the town of Pasco.
There was a racial divide that was established quite early. In fact, there were no minorities, or very few, that lived in Richland. Kennewick, the next town down from Richland, was a sundown town where if you were Black and found in the town after the sun went down, you would be run out of town. Minorities, both the Blacks that moved to the area to work on the Hanford plant and the many Hispanic workers who eventually ended up working at Hanford, tended to live in Pasco, and especially in a particular part of Pasco. And that's another reason why these towns have such different characters today, is they have very different ethnic backgrounds. You know, many of the people that came to work at Hanford had to be recruited from elsewhere in the United States, and DuPont had a lot of factories in the South. And there were a lot of workers from the South who came to both construct Hanford and then also work as operators at Hanford through its entire time. So, you know, the Tri-Cities still has a little bit of a Southern flavor too, compared to other towns in Washington State.
The production of plutonium at the Hanford facility continued until the late 1980s. This process expanded to other locations throughout the United States.
Plutonium was in the very first bomb that was exploded, the Trinity test in New Mexico on July 16th, 1945. Plutonium was also in the bomb that was detonated over Nagasaki. The Hiroshima bomb used uranium that had been enriched at the Oak Ridge facility in Tennessee. But it was realized, as soon as those two bombs were detonated, that plutonium was a much superior substance to use as the triggers for nuclear weapons. So all of our nuclear weapons today are built around a small pit of plutonium, which acts as a trigger for the bomb. And essentially, that means that all of our bombs are just more or less based on the bomb that was exploded at the Trinity test and the bomb that was exploded over Nagasaki. So after the World War II, it was realized that the United States, unfortunately, was going to get itself engaged in this arms race with the Soviet Union, and that the United States would reach much more plutonium. So eventually 9 reactors were built at Hanford, in addition to the 6 more after the 3 that were built during World War II. And they generated plutonium for decades. They were really cranking out plutonium in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s when I was living in Othello, just 15 miles away from the nearest reactor. But by the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the United States had just an insane number of nuclear weapons, 25 to 30,000, Russia had that many as well. I mean, more weapons than these countries that they could ever logically be used. Can't really logically use nuclear weapons anyway, but it was just absurd, the number of weapons that they built. And the United States and Soviet Union at sort of the same point, before the end of the Cold War, realized that they had way more plutonium than they would ever need, that their plutonium production facilities had produced lots of material for nuclear weapons, and that some of these nuclear weapons were eventually going to have to be decommissioned, a process which is still going on today. So both in the Soviet Union and in the United States, a decision was made that these plutonium production factories could be closed down. So the last plutonium at Hanford was made in the 1970s and 1980s, after which production was ceased. And the mission of the operations at Hanford really shifted from plutonium production to cleanup, and cleanup has been going on ever since.
Today, there are about 177 underground tanks at Hanford holding over 55 million gallons of highly radioactive and toxic waste. In the decades since plutonium production ended, attempts to safely remove waste and decommission facilities has been marred with inadequate solutions and technology, unexpected complications, and poor record keeping. Cleaning out the underground tanks is urgent, because if these issues aren't properly addressed, these tanks that hold waste will continue to corrode and develop leaks, contaminating the surrounding land and nearby Columbia River at very high levels. At present, 2 tanks at Hanford are known to be leaking, and it's estimated that about 1 million gallons of waste has already leaked. The Department of Energy estimates that cleaning up the entire Hanford site will cost between $300 billion and $600 billion, and will take until 2078 to accomplish. For many advocates, activists, and nearby residents who are directly impacted by Hanford, 2078 won't come soon enough. And some of those proposed cleanup measures being discussed fall short of the original promises that were made. To learn more about Hanford cleanup, we spoke with Britany-Lindley.
My name is Britany Kee Eichman-Lindley. I am an Alaskan Indigenous Islander of the Tlingit Nation and Tsimshian and Tahltan heritage. I am an alumna of Pacific Lutheran University, AHA International London, Seattle University School of Law, and Native Action Network. I work as a tribal court judge for the member tribes of Northwest Intertribal Court Systems and a staff attorney for Hanford Challenge, a Seattle-based nonprofit that works to promote a safe and effective cleanup of Hanford nuclear site.
Hanford Challenge, which was founded in 2007, works to create a future for Hanford that secures human health and safety, advances accountability, and promotes a sustainable environmental legacy.
One of the most important things we do at Hanford Challenge is represent whistleblowers and help workers on the front lines of Hanford cleanup. And we're the only organization focused on Hanford that does this work. As staff attorney, I primarily assist Hanford workers to report safety concerns at the site and represent Hanford whistleblowers who have experienced retaliation for raising safety concerns. Hanford Challenge leads and participates in collaborative problem solving with the broader Hanford community, which includes workers, former workers, and their families, tribes and tribal members, the Oregon Department of Energy, regulators like the state of Washington and EPA, and other nonprofits working on Hanford cleanup, and of course the public. We also participate in the Hanford Advisory Board, which gives advice to agencies running and regulating cleanup. And we do a lot of education and outreach to mobilize the public to weigh in on Hanford cleanup decisions with the goal of building a safer, cleaner future. We host and participate in scholastic and public events and share information in person, in webinars, on social media, and on our website.
Proposed solutions for disposing Hanford's waste have included vitrification, the process of turning waste into glass, using grout instead of glass to stabilize radioactive waste, and stretching out the cleanup schedule. The process for finding an adequate long-term solution, unfortunately and perhaps unsurprisingly, has been plagued with problems that go back to its founding.
As Hanford was part of the Manhattan Project to produce the plutonium used to create the world's first nuclear weapons, the project was shrouded in secrecy and urgency that resulted in environmental harm to a region occupied by 3 states and 3 federally recognized tribal nations: Washington, Yakima, Oregon, Umatilla, Idaho, and Nez Perce. Throughout its production era, Hanford had shameful hazardous waste disposal practices and poor record keeping. This legacy still affects Hanford cleanup operations and the environment today. One way to think about cleanup is getting Hanford's waste into a less mobile forms. That can look like pumping and treating groundwater to remove some contaminants, or digging up the waste that's in the ground and moving it to a lined landfill in the center of the site. Unfortunately, the history of secrecy and suppressing worker concerns in favor of profit means there are boondoggled cleanup projects, like the waste treatment plant, that are billions of dollars over budget and decades past their original schedule. Hanford Challenge represented the whistleblowers that raised the major issues with safety and fraud in an effort to get a plant that will actually work. Next year, we should see the first batch of Hanford tank waste immobilized in class. There is also a tendency to overlook problems when there is a promise of something being faster and cheaper at Hanford. Even though we've seen time and time again that nothing is faster and cheaper at Hanford. We're really seeing this with the current controversy over grout and grouting Hanford tank waste. Despite many red flags and past failures making grout work, enthusiasts are overlooking these problems and latching on to the promise that grout is the faster, cheaper solution for Hanford's tank waste. It's part of our job at Hanford Challenge to raise these concerns and ask questions. We don't want money being poured into a project that isn't going to work. We still think that putting the tank waste in glass is the best option. Another example is the 324 building, which is located 1.5 miles from the city of Richland and only 300 yards away from the Columbia River. The building was originally a nuclear research and development facility in the 1960s. In 1986, a spill of 1.3 million curies of concentrated cesium-137 and strontium-90 occurred on site in 324 building's B cell. Yet, it wasn't until 2010 that the contaminated soil was discovered under the building. And not until 2023 that data confirmed that the contaminated soil is consistent with what would be expected from that 1986 spill. As of this month, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and U.S. Department of Energy are meeting and looping in the Washington State Department of Ecology to evaluate different options for 324 building cleanup.
Hanford's contamination and cleanup doesn't only impact the nearby environment, but also the many indigenous communities that lost access to Hanford and parts of the Columbia River when the government established the plutonium facility on their land.
Hanford Nuclear Site was built on the ancestral land of several Native American tribes who have been here since time immemorial. The U.S. government forced the Wanapum to relocate, and other tribes lost their treaty right access to the land and fishing grounds, including the Yakima Nation, Nez Perce tribe, and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. The bands and tribes that did not enter into treaties in the area, such as the Wanapum, work directly with the federal government to protect their cultural ties to the land. It is an ongoing battle to have the United States honor, and in some cases, even be aware of tribal treaty rights. Another big concern is that the government to government consultation is often criticized as being treated as a checkbox rather than meaningful consultation. Probably one of the biggest impacts on Indigenous communities right now is that access continues to be restricted to their culturally significant sites due to the extensive contamination at Hanford.
And that extensive contamination at Hanford may have led to high rates of thyroid cancer and other health problems for workers and nearby residents. The Department of Energy has conducted almost 20 studies over the past 24 years, which examined the safety risks that the contamination poses. In 2014, a report found that toxins in the air far exceeded occupational limits and linked that exposure to lung and brain damage.
Many Hanford workers former workers, and people in the area, including tribal members, have had their health affected by exposure to toxic and radioactive materials from Hanford nuclear site. Hanford exposures can result in a plethora of health issues, including respiratory problems, heart problems, neurological diseases, and cancers. One of our biggest fights at Hanford Challenge has been protecting Hanford workers from chemical vapor exposures. These kinds of exposures come from toxic vapors that build up in the top of Hanford's underground tanks and vent out to be inhaled by workers, sometimes with little to no warning. Workers who have been exposed to vapors have experienced symptoms like headaches, bloody noses, metallic taste in their mouths, dizziness, or shortness of breath, or many times all of the above. During my time as a legal extern with Hanford Challenge, we helped lead efforts for a new Washington presumption of illness law that provides Hanford workers with a presumption of causation for a list of illnesses, which generally means that it's assumed that specific illnesses Hanford workers experience came from exposure at Hanford. The law's passage was in large part motivated by the testimony from numerous Hanford workers who had become sickened with serious and long-term illnesses resulting from exposure to toxic vapors at Hanford. And I was there to witness these powerful testimonies. And again, when Governor Inslee signed this bill into law, which was a really exciting day. During Hanford's heyday, when the site was actively producing plutonium, people of the surrounding area often unknowingly experienced Hanford exposures as hazardous chemicals and radionuclides were discharged directly into the air, ground, and Columbia River. These people are often referred to as downwinders because they live downwind, downstream, up the food chain, or down the generations from these radioactive exposures. Downwinder communities near nuclear facilities around the country struggle to get their health impacts acknowledged. Today, the public is still at risk, which is why Congress is pouring nearly $3 billion a year into cleaning up the site. For example, we've tested dust in multiple people's homes around the Tri-Cities and found radionuclides. And during the demolition of the plutonium finishing plant, a really radioactive building, we tracked plutonium particles in the filters of workers' cars that were leaving the site. Radioactive and chemical contamination is also reaching the groundwater that flows into the Columbia River. For example, a publicly accessible database shows radioactive, cancer-causing strontium-90 persisting at extraordinarily high levels near the cocooned end reactor, which is very close to the Columbia River. Strontium-90 levels remain over 2,000 times the drinking water standard. Water seeping from the shoreline also exceeds drinking water standards. These examples show the problem with some of Hanford's contamination. It doesn't obey fences and signs. It can move around, which is why it is so important to contain it so it can't get into our water, food, and air, and why it is so important to listen to workers who are raising safety concerns.
The cleanup of Hanford has been ongoing for over 3 decades now. And in that time, many workers have come forward to raise safety concerns and attention towards the actions of contractors and the government that attempt to minimize problems at Hanford. Many times, whistleblowers risk their careers by doing so. Hanford Challenge represented Shelley Doss, a former environmental specialist, against her former employer, Washington River Protection Solutions. In 2014, the Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration found that the contractor had violated federal whistleblower provisions when it fired Doss when she repeatedly raised issues of numerous nuclear and environmental safety violations. Hanford Challenge also represented Walter Ford, a former Hanford vitrification plant employee. In 2015, an administrative law judge ruled that his actions in reporting workplace safety concerns at Hanford contributed to a decision to lay him off. These experiences for those who speak up, unfortunately, aren't unique. And that's why the work that Britany-Lindley and Hanford Challenge does is so important. Over the last 3 decades of cleanup, Hanford Challenge has worked closely with whistleblowers, elevating their voices and helping them navigate the complex system of reporting safety concerns.
One of the most impactful parts of my job is helping Hanford whistleblowers and workers just navigate the complex maze of reporting safety concerns at Hanford. For a hypothetical example, if an environmental compliance officer whose job it is to report problems like leaking waste is told to cover up a problem instead of reporting it, it can be really confusing to know what to do or where to go. And for a lot of workers, they also have pressures from their coworkers to stay quiet or do as they're told because they don't want to get fired or lose a bonus. So we're here to help in those situations and provide guidance and legal representation if necessary to those workers. Sometimes we talk with the worker and it's just one conversation. We just point them in the right direction, tell them who to talk to. And other times we might work with someone for years. Sometimes it is anonymous, and other times we're working with whistleblowers who go public with their issues, like Walt Ford, Donna Bushy, Kurt Clem and Matt Spencer, Shelley Doss, and others. Over the years, we have diligently helped hundreds of Hanford workers and whistleblowers advocate for a safer cleanup.
Cleanup at Hanford still faces huge challenges, and it's a high-stakes situation. So what lies ahead for the site?
More people should know that Hanford Cleanup is a multi-generational project that will last for hundreds of thousands of years. Once the cleanup is done, the work isn't finished. The waste that is left there will require monitoring forever. It is more like an intergenerational relay race that never ends. It reminds me of this quote from Shannon Cram that she writes in her new book, Unmaking the Bomb. As scientists were tasked with deciding what the risk was from exposure to radiation from nuclear weapons and waste, they concluded with recommendations for a person's radiation exposure level that was, quote, not harmless, mind you, but reasonable. At Hanford Challenge, we want more people to be actively involved in deciding how clean is clean and how dirty is reasonable. Whether we personally made this mess or not, we're responsible for protecting this place, our water, our wildlife, and our way of life. We all live downriver from Hanford, and together, we can change Hanford's toxic legacy.
Thank you to Britany Lindley and Steve Olson for joining this episode of Nuke Talk. To learn more about the history of Hanford and its cleanup, visit Hanford Challenge at hanfordchallenge.org and check out Steve Olson's book, The Apocalypse Factory: Plutonium and the Making of the Atomic Age, available anywhere you get your books. And thank you for listening to Nuke Talk, brought to you by Plowshares. To support our work on the podcast and in making our world safer from the nuclear threat, visit plowshares.org. See you next episode.